Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be talking Edsel, specifically Edsel's inaugural year wagon lineup for 1958. Ford launched Edsel with a fully fleshed out model line for 1958, and the wagons were no exception. Split into three model lines, Edsel wagons consisted of the two-door Roundup, the four-door Villager, and the four-door Bermuda. The story of the short-lived Edsel experiment and why it failed is something that has been discussed endlessly over the last 65 years, and that's a discussion for another video. But today, we're going to dive into each of the wagons offered for 1958, talk about where Edsel fit in between the Ford and Mercury lineups, and discuss some of the 1958 Edsel and Edsel Wagon unique features and styling attributes. We'll talk individually about the Roundup, the Villager, and the Bermuda, but first, let's compare the Edsel Wagon lineup for 1958 to the Ford and Mercury offerings for the same year, and see where Edsel fit in. And if you like this video, as usual, please subscribe, like, and comment. It greatly helps our content get out there and be promoted on YouTube's algorithm. Ford management identified a gap between the Ford and Mercury lineups that needed to be filled, and for 1958, Edsel was launched to fill that gap. With GM having so many brands, Chevrolet, Pontiac, Oldsmobile, Buick, and Cadillac, and Chrysler fielding Plymouth, Dodge, DeSoto, Chrysler, and Imperial, it doesn't seem totally crazy that Ford would be able to successfully launch a new brand positioned in between Ford and Mercury. So let's look at a breakdown of how the Edsel wagon models were priced to fill the gap between Ford and Mercury. Riding on the same 116-inch wheelbase as the Ford wagons, the Edsel wagons were very closely related to their Ford counterparts, and not the larger, hardtop-only wagons fielded by Mercury in 1958. Let's take a look at the model and price comparison. As you can see, the Edsels definitely achieved the goal of filling the price gap between Ford and Mercury. Using Ford-based cars and moving them upmarket, in theory, made good financial sense for Ford. But as we know, the buying public wasn't particularly enamored with Edsel styling or the higher prices. What do you think? Did Edsel fill a legitimate gap, or was the idea of paying more money for what was essentially a spruced up Ford a bad idea from the start? Let us know in the comments. The new Edsel was hyped up by Ford and promised to be a revolutionary car for 1958. Expectations from both Ford executives and the general public were high going into launch. While the final product may have been a bit of a letdown, the Edsel did ship with a few interesting features that are of note. First is the Teletouch Drive system. Buttons for shifting right on the steering wheel. A supposed safety feature that allows you to keep your hands closer to the wheel at all times. By 1958, though, Edsel was not the only company with push-button shifting. Chrysler Corporation, even Packard, and Mercury, and perhaps others too, had used push-button shifting. However, having the electronically operated buttons located in the center of the steering wheel was the Edsel's unique feature, and that was what allowed them to claim the safety advantage as well. However, the Teletouch Drive was problematic and unreliable, costing $231.40 as an option, which is over $2,500 in today's money. However, despite that, sources indicate that the Teletouch was extremely popular, with the overwhelming majority of Edsels being purchased with this option, and only a very small percentage using manual transmissions or the other available automatic. The next interesting feature is the dial temp air system and air conditioning. A simple dial switch to alternate between heating, cooling, and defrost, and to adjust the temperature all in one. It doesn't sound like a big deal to us today necessarily, but over the decades there have been a lot of unnecessarily complicated climate control systems in cars especially in the 1950s, with various levers, knobs, and unclear labeling. Dial temp really does look like it was a simpler solution. Dial temp with air conditioning was a $417.70 option on wagons, which equates to a whopping $4,562 today. Next feature was the speed warning light speedometer, and this thing's actually pretty cool. Not only was the speedometer design itself unique, rotating around, it would also, however, glow bright red if the driver exceeded a preset speed limit. I'm always curious how many drivers ever use these speed warning devices. They were common options back then in the 50s and 60s, and they still exist in one form or another on many cars today. I've never used one. I'm curious to see if any of you ever use these features. But this one in particular, like was mentioned earlier, it glows the whole speedometer bright red, and it looks pretty cool, so maybe people used it just for the novelty factor. Next feature that was not available on wagons, but it was available on the other models, sedans, hardtops, and convertibles, was the automatic trunk opener. You insert the trunk key and push the button, and boom, the trunk opens, just like magic. This setup remained pretty common for decades, really, until car companies finally got rid of the key requirement on buttons and also the separate key used for trunks. But it was a fairly revolutionary and a new option that Edsel had at the time. Next interesting feature is the Edsel engines themselves. Edsel models came with exclusive engines, the E400 and the E475. No 6 cylinders here, all V8s. In an era where engines were typically labeled for their displacement, Edsel went a different route and named the engine based off of the torque rating. So the E400 engine put out 400 pound-feet of torque, and the E475 put out 475 pound-feet of torque. Since most consumers were used to numbers indicating displacement, they likely, however, thought that the Edsel engines were larger than they actually were. They were thinking 400 and 475 cubic inches. So, tricky job by the Edsel marketers. This type of naming scheme actually is something that Cadillac does today. You'll see Cadillac models labeled things like 600 and 450, and that actually relates to torque, not engine displacement. Those are the primary interesting features of the 1958 Edsels. So now let's talk about styling. Despite being the shortest Edsels in terms of wheelbase and overall length, the Edsel wagons kept the Edsel family look, with the same front end and side styling treatments of the sedan, hardtop, and convertible models. Around back is where things were different, and where things got interesting, and also controversial. Here's a picture of the back of an Edsel wagon. Can you spot the problem here? Well, you see the inward-facing arrow or boomerang taillights also doubled as the turn signals. So, that means the left turn signal would flash a rightward pointing arrow, and the right turn signal would flash a leftward pointing arrow. Now, who knows whether this actually led to any accidents or some sort of mass confusion, but it was definitely an oversight during the design of the vehicle that remains much talked about to this day. That's really the most unique element of the styling of these cars, other than the front end, which is identical to the rest of the Edsels. So let's dig into the differences now between the three wagon models. Now, they're all the same size of vehicle based on the 116-inch wheelbase, and they all have the same basic styling. However, the three trim levels did have some distinctions between them. So let's start with the Roundup. The Roundup represented the entry-level Edsel wagon. We have the two-door, six-passenger model. For perspective, this would be the Edsel version of the Ford Ranch Wagon, except it cost about $450 more, which equates to about $5,000 when adjusted for inflation, as we saw on that chart earlier in the video. Despite the higher price than the Ford equivalent, the Roundup didn't come with a lot of luxuries. It was still a basic model. Black rubber flooring, sliding rear windows. However, upholstery options were nicer, with Edsel's unique box calf grain vinyl trims available in several colors, as well as a couple cloth and vinyl options that gave the interior a slightly less utilitarian vibe than the Ford base Ranch Wagon. However, Ford's Ranch Wagon was also available in a Del Rio Ranch Wagon variant that added more colorful interior options similar to what Edsel had, for $300 less than the Roundup. But with the Edsel, you did get the unique Edsel front and rear end styling, for better or worse, the higher end appearance of the dashboard and interior treatment in general, and the available goodies like the Teletouch Drive, the rotary speedometer, dial temp air, and the standard larger, more powerful E400 V8. So, the price difference was somewhat justified. By 1958, however, two-door wagons were losing popularity, and when you couple that fact with Edsel's less than stellar popularity, you end up with a mere 963 units rolling off of the assembly line for 1958. That brings us to the middle trim level, the Villager, which was roughly the Edsel equivalent of the Ford Country sedan. A fun fact is that the Villager name would be the only wagon to survive for the entirety of the 3-year Edsel experiment. It's also a name that would be revived and used by Mercury for many years. Styling was basically the same as the Roundup, however in a 4-door variant. This is basically a 4-door version of the Roundup. Available interior upholstery and trim options were the same as well, just like how Ford's Country sedan and Del Rio Ranch wagons offered the same interior trim offerings. The real difference between the Villager and the Roundup was the 4-door body style and the availability of 4 power windows and a 9-passenger variant. As discussed earlier, the 2-door wagon craze was really dying down by 1958. So it's no surprise then that the Villager far outsold the Roundup. In fact, Edsel sold more Villagers than Roundups and Bermudas combined, with 2,294 6-passenger wagons and 978 9-passenger wagons sold. Now this is the one everyone wants to talk about, and the one that you most often see restored and presented at car shows. We're talking about the Edsel Bermuda wagon. As was the norm in the 1950s, the highest trim level wagon carried the woody look on the exterior, so it really stands out and is easy to identify as the top of the line model. Available in a variety of two-tone paint schemes and the simulated wood trim, you could tell just by looking at the Bermuda's trim and paint that this was the expensive model. You had the best Edsel wagon. Inside, things were taken up a notch as well. There were 5 interior trims to choose from. 4 all-vinyl trims with the unique Edsel box calf grain vinyl in bright colors, and the one trim that everyone loves to see, the brown Saran jug cloth with driftwood vinyl bolsters. This unique cloth design is the must-have trim if you have a Bermuda wagon. It's the one that stands out, it's the one that is very unique, and it's probably the one you've seen most often if you've ever seen one of these Bermudas in person. Another interior distinction is that instead of the black rubber floor mats that were standard on Roundup and Villager, the Bermuda was available with a handful of colored rubber floor mat options that were color keyed to the exterior paint color. Though most people who restore their Bermuda have chosen to use carpet that coordinates with the interior trim. Here at SMS, we have been doing factory correct Edsel interiors for decades. When the original materials stopped being available, we developed the tooling and the patterns to make them ourselves, and that includes this cloth for the Bermuda that we weave in our own facility. So if you've seen a fully restored 1958 Edsel wagon, it is likely that it's got an SMS interior in it. We really take pride in the ability to get these rare cars looking like they just rolled out of the showroom. It's preserving history, and a very important part of automotive history. Anyway, the Bermuda didn't sell quite as well as the Villager. Being that it was the most expensive model, that makes sense. With 1,456 six-passenger wagons and a mere 779 nine-passenger wagons finding homes. That means that the nine-passenger Bermuda is the rarest Edsel wagon of 1958. So a few final thoughts. It's likely that most of you watching this video know how the Edsel story ends and how it goes. The 1958 lineup was the largest lineup, most complete lineup that Edsel would field during its 3-model-year run, and the only year that it would offer 3 distinct series of wagons. There are several factors that led to the failure of Edsel, of course, from controversial styling to the lack of uniqueness to changing customer tastes and a bad economy. While Edsel has gone down in history as perhaps the biggest automotive failure ever, we can't help but love these cars and are really glad to see that so many of them have been preserved and restored. So what do you think? Are you a fan of the Edsel wagons, or Edsel in general? Do you think they're just awkwardly styled and overpriced Fords? Either way, let us know in the comments. And if you like this video, please subscribe to the channel for more of our classic car content. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.